Okay, so again to remind everyone that the format of this special presentation is that we're going to have the three speakers from Australia give their presentations and their different perspectives related to biosecurity, and then the last portion, roughly 25 minutes or so, we're hoping to engage with you all in discussion, and so all speakers will have an opportunity to answer questions, and we really welcome as many questions as possible, especially from the students. And so I'd like to introduce our first speaker. So I guess Dr. Phill Cassey, while I'm reading off your bio, if you want to start sharing your screen, that would be great. And so I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Phill Cassey. He is the head of the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at the University of Adelaide. He has studied environmental biosecurity and wildlife conservation for over 20 years and is globally recognized for his research in invasion ecology and illegal wildlife trade. He has published over 300 international scientific research papers and is a vocal advocate for equity and inclusivity in scientific research and training practices. Phill is an academic member of the ALERT, and I don't know if I pronounced that acronym properly, and Interpol Wildlife Crime Working Groups. In 2019, he was nominated by the Australian government, the Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment, to represent Australia as a lead author on the United Nations Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES, the Global Biodiversity Assessment Report. And so without further ado, welcome Dr. Cassey.
Thank you, Andrea. And good afternoon, everyone. Mani Napudni. That's welcome you all in the local language of the Kaurna Miona, the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Hills and Plains, which is the land that I live, learn and work on. So I'm going to be talking about vertebrate invasive species management in Australia. And 15 minutes is quite a challenge to cover a century of invasive vertebrate species pest management. But it all starts, as with any colonialized country, with the legacy of the acclimatization societies. So these were groups that brought in a wide range of vertebrate species in order to try and reclaim their national heritage. They were brought in as game species. They were brought in as backyard species. And in Australia, there was over 100 species of established, mostly mammals, birds, and freshwater fish that were brought in to try and enhance the native species, which in some cases were described as depauperate, which, when you think of the nations, New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, is quite ridiculous, really. And the legacy that these species have had over the last 100 plus years is that they have caused enormous impacts. When we think of Australia, we often think of the very high endemism, the incredible diversity of species that are so different from anywhere else in the world. But there's also some really shocking statistics associated with extinction, particularly of small-bodied mammal species. So Australia has the rather notorious record of having the highest extinction in the last 300 years of mammal species anywhere in the world. The first of these to go was the thylacine. This was hunted to extinction, the Tasmanian tiger, by people. But then after that, we see the number of species going extinct being largely attributed to the indirect effects of humans. So the introduction, particularly, of two very abundant and prolific predatory, medium body-sized predatory species, the European fox and the feralized domestic cat. And these have caused phenomenal impacts across both the mainland of Australia, but also across the many islands around Australia. And the economic damage that a small number of mammal species have done in Australia is also huge. So I know that that Andy's going to talk a lot more about the broader impacts of invasive species in Australia, but I'm just going to quickly focus on 5 mammal species and 1 species of bird that has a reported economic agricultural damage of over $700 million a year. And that's not considering the environmental impacts of these species and others like the domestic cat. So it's very hard to estimate and evaluate the cost, the economic impact of these species on the environment. One study attempted to value the lives of individual birds, native birds, at $1, and came up with an environmental impact of $144 million per year for cats. And it's not just birds. This is a remote school. The picture there in the middle is from a remote school where the students have caught 12 cats and they're dissecting the stomach contents. And although it's difficult to see from this image, the majority of those species are small lizards, reptile species. And the record that I've seen is 45 individual reptiles pulled out of the single stomach contents of a feral cat. So they're having these huge impacts. It's not all negative. We have started to remove species from areas, and islands are one example of isolated land masses for which we have been very effective in our eradication of these species. So Australia has an enormous coastline, has over 8,000 offshore islands, and over 500 of those have records of alien vertebrate species on them. And over 300 of them have had eradication attempts. So a while ago, I was embarrassed to see that actually this study was conducted over 10 years ago now, or around 10 years ago, which makes me feel even older than I need to. But we compiled eradication data for these islands. You can see that Western Australia, if you don't know Australia very well, the state of Western Australia has by far the longest coastline, has a huge number of islands, and so equally had the largest number of eradication attempts. And what was maybe surprising to us when we initially compiled the data was actually the vast majority of these vertebrate eradications were successful. And this is partly because when you undertake an eradication, the goal is to remove the species. And in a lot of cases, therefore, the target species and the target island are well identified. It doesn't mean they're successful in all cases, and there's also a range of islands and species for which we found failed successes, which might sound like a little bit of contradiction, but that's islands where the eradication was initially successful, but it was too close to the mainland. The invasion attempt was, or the invasion history then allowed for the species to re-invade at a subsequent time. There hasn't been a lot of change in success through time, although the numbers of eradication attempts clearly peaked in the 1960s and the 2000s, and they've largely been on islands which were identified as eradicable. The species that were mostly attempted are some of the species for which Australia has identified them as key threatening processes. So mammalian predators, destructive herbivores, mice and goats and pigs and rabbits have incredible impacts on both the agricultural and environmental sectors. And these are the species for which the most eradication attempts have been conducted. There's 3 species here that if you look really closely, the island eradication succeeded in every single attempt. And those are in fact feral domesticated populations where they literally, they backed the boat up, they herded them on, and they left the island. So it didn't take the same kind of effect that other eradications required. And there's really powerful effects of the actual island characteristics on these removals and eradications. So for those key threatening species, there's differences in the probability of success across those species. So for instance, medium-sized species which do not take toxin baits quite as readily, so rabbit and cat, have lower success generally than other species. Species like goats, which are often shot out of islands, and also have Judas techniques used a lot, where a single animal is radio tagged, and then because of their herding behavior, they're able to go in and find that animal and find the other conspecifics around it and shoot them all, are generally more successful. Success declines with island size. So the bigger the island, the harder it is to eradicate, which is quite obvious, and also characteristics of altitude and ruggedness. So this is Lord Howe Island, which is a great success story in Australian eradications, but it was inherently hard because of its very difficult terrain and its ruggedness. And they needed helicopters to shoot the goats, and then a lot of deployment of bait for the rodent species. And cost of eradication increases enormously with island size across all mammal groups. This is a picture of a colleague, Melissa Horton, with the last rabbit that was trapped on the subantarctic Macquarie Island. And in order to remove rabbits, they literally threw every single approach in the toolbox at the island. It's a huge success story of over a decade of eradication efforts across multiple Commonwealth governments. Cost around $25 million to remove cats, rabbits, and black rats off the island, and mice. And it from 144 square kilometres, which is actually a relatively small island, but hugely difficult. So the approaches we use are a variety of manual and mechanical approaches, as well as chemical use of toxins and baits. And sometimes we even get as clever as combining these systems. So this is a Felix delivery system, which uses a bait delivery method where it actually shoots the bait onto the target animal, in this case a cat, and then the cat grooms off the toxin. So it's a costly device. It's a fixed device. It's going to have very limited success across an area as large as mainland Australia. And so, we use novel approaches like biological control, the manipulation of diseases, and also genetic approaches are being proposed, in which we can manipulate the population, particularly along the lines of sexual modification. But when you get even success on islands, not all islands are the same, and some are much bigger. We have really cherry-picked a lot of the islands in which we have managed to remove species from. And this is Kangaroo Island. So Macquarie Island, which I mentioned earlier, is less than 3% the size of Kangaroo Island, which is in South Australia, where I'm from. And it is currently the site of a huge feral cat eradication program, which is going to be very difficult using traditional trapping techniques. Which leads, some people back on the mainland. This is from a colleague, Michael Bode, who suggests that the future for Australian animals is fenced, because so much of the conservation of these small remaining small to medium-sized native mammals is either on islands or within fenced reserves on mainland Australia, because without the scalability of new techniques, traditional control methods are not going to be able to eradicate these species from Australia. Diseases have certainly been a welcome introduction into the control toolbox. For rabbits, the introduction of initially myxomatosis, and then the rabbit flea to deliver the disease, and then the introduction of a variety of variants of rabbit hemorrhagic disease have allowed population suppression. But we still have rabbits, and we're still looking for new control methods to remove them. And when we got rid of them from Macquarie Island, everything was done. The warrens were ripped, the diseases were introduced, they were trapped, they were baited, and the last rabbit that you saw Melissa holding was shot. There were dedicated dogs out on the island. So it's a real challenge still for mainland Australia, which leads to these ideas of novel genetic approaches. And I don't have time to go into them, but if you're interested in the development of the technology in mammals, then I suggest you looking up this recent paper, which is leading the development of these in rodent species. It's not going to be an approach that scales well to long-living, larger-bodied mammal species at this stage, but certainly in small-bodied, fast-reproducing species, there is potential, as long as the right safeguards are in place, for genetic editing to be used as a control approach. But unfortunately, these are legacy species that we've had for hundreds of years. They're still causing enormous impacts on our economy and environment, and we haven't been able to control them to an adequate suppression or close to eradication. And yet we're still introducing new species, and some of these species we haven't even tried to successfully eradicate. So no snake species has ever been eradicated once established, and I believe that Adam's going to tell us a lot more about the risks that these species are to Australia in the future. So some quick take-home messages. With current control technologies, eradication is feasible on islands and at the very early stages of invasion when the populations are small. Early detection capabilities are critical to being able to assist in that. Biological controls through disease and genetic modification are likely to be able to achieve good population suppression, but we still haven't got to the point with key vertebrate species where we're seeing eradication. And finally, into the future, prevention. What we've learned from the past is that prevention of invaders is much more cost effective than eradication or long-term control. These are incredibly costly species and costly management approaches. And so particularly in Australia, but everywhere, pre and post-border biosecurity is essential and never ending, which leads hopefully into Adam's talk. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. That was a really great, and I know it's very difficult in a country like Australia, which has such a deep history with invasive species, to cover that all in 15 minutes, but I think you did a really excellent job. At this time, I think while Dr. Toomes is setting up his presentation, we can entertain any questions from the audience for Dr. Cassey. Everyone's shy. But that's okay, because there'll be other opportunities towards the end of the period that we have today. Great. Okay, so I will introduce Dr. Toomes. Dr. Adam Toomes is a postdoctoral researcher based in South Australia at the University of Adelaide. Dr. Cassey is his supervisor. Adam's overarching focus is on the international wildlife trade and its many impacts, trends, and complex driving factors. Currently, Adam is researching the global trade of reptiles endemic to Australia, using online trade, species traits, and wildlife enforcement intelligence to anticipate the risk of unsustainable trade to threatened populations. Welcome. Adam.
Thank you very much, Andrea, and thanks everyone for coming today. So yeah, hopefully you can see everything fine and hear me fine. So Phil's just presented on sort of like the historical threat of invasive species in Australia, and really has a lot of sort of colonial origins in the deliberate moving of species into the country. And I'm going to be talking a little bit more about what we anticipate is the new wave of invasive species, which is largely resulting from sort of globalization of our trade and transport from to consumers. Obviously, that's a lot harder to predict because then these species aren't being brought here deliberately. And a major facet of, or a major pathway that invasive species are being brought here is through the wildlife trade, specifically the trade in exotic pets. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. Before I start, just like to acknowledge that there's a lot of people who've worked on the projects that I'll be presenting on today, and I've listed their names below. And I'd also, of course, like to acknowledge that the work that we have conducted was based on the Adelaide Plains, which is the lands of the Kaurna people. And I'd just like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I've left some QR codes throughout the presentation to link to papers and further reading if anyone is interested. I might just put in a little pointer so you can see where I'm moving. That'd be a bit better. And also just to note that there are some pictures of wildlife trade in the presentation. I've tried to make them pretty sort of mild, but just be aware that is in these slides. Okay, so what actually is wildlife trade? Well, it means different things to different people. To the broader public, you're probably familiar with things like Tiger King or some of the Netflix documentaries about the pangolin trade. You might have heard of the ivory trade or the trade of rhino horn. Those are the ones that often are popularized in general media. If you're interested in more sort of broader science communication outlets, you might be aware of, through various media coverages or through opinion pieces, the trade is a lot more broad than that. So obviously there's a lot of like small primates that are traded. Most vertebrates are often covered in those kind of media outlets. Whereas scientists who research the trade through looking at what's actually advertised in markets or what is available through seizures, will realize that actually the trade is ever present, and it actually spans the tree of life. So you can see here anything from corals, invertebrates, fish, reptiles, mammals, birds, you name it. Everything is traded to some degree. And in fact, these figures here are actually probably, I won't go into it too much, but they're probably dramatic underestimates of the number of species that are traded in these groups. And the trade also has a global distribution. So this is just for reptiles. And you can see that, apart from the, permanently snowbound regions, pretty much no area isn't represented in wildlife trade. So it's sort of insidious throughout. And why actually is that? Well, it's really a combination of sort of the trifecta in our modernization and globalization of our transport networks, our ability to communicate across countries, and our economic development, particularly in regions that previously had quite slow economic development. So transport, obviously, there's been a revolution in the ease and affordability of the movement of goods that we trade, but also people through tourism or migration. And that facilitates, from a wildlife trade perspective, facilitates the movement of animals across more jurisdictions and across larger distances than was previously possible. From Australia's perspective, as Phil's mentioned, a lot of the historic trade has been, due to its part in the Commonwealth. So, lots of trade with the United Kingdom and other parts of the Commonwealth and New Zealand. More recently, we're seeing a much bigger influence of trade with China and Southeast Asia, which is a region which is rapidly developing in terms of its contribution to both global resource consumption and international movement of goods. So that brings with it a whole suite of different transport pathways and potential ways that exotic pets can make their way into the country that we haven't previously had to deal with. There's also ongoing economic development and infrastructure development in new areas. So while this is a source of habitat destruction in and of itself, clearing a rainforest to make roads or to make plantations, for example, a secondary side effect is that is bringing humans into closer contact with native populations of wildlife that they otherwise would have been quite far away from. So this animal here is the helmeted hornbill, and the purple outline here was this historic range. The dark green is where it's actually present in forests, and then the light green is where a human can be within 5 kilometers of that forest. So, it's never been easier to go out and catch wildlife, and it's never been easier to transport that wildlife to other countries. And there's other examples of economic development happening. The Indonesian capital will be moving to Borneo. China is developing its Belt and Road Initiative across many different countries in Africa and the Middle East. So this is a trend that's going to continue to happen, and it's going to introduce species into this sort of trade pipeline that weren't previously in it before. And with that brings whole new risks around disease transmission and the spread of those species themselves. And finally, our ability to communicate has also globalized. So with economic development, there's a pretty consistent trend that internet access increases pretty much proportionally to that. But it's not just access to the internet, it's access to e-commerce trading platforms and social media platforms that provide you with an international customer base and sometimes the ability to advertise products anonymously. So we've got new species entering a market, new ways to transport them globally, and new ways to actually communicate with the consumers. And particularly in Asia and Africa, internet user access is dramatically increasing. So those three things all combined together, and you might be thinking, well, so what? So the implication of that really is that feasibly, with enough demand, any species could become popular online, be harvested from the wild, kept in captivity, transported between countries or within countries, and sold to end users in virtually anywhere. And an example I like to use, which really exemplifies that, is the Union Island gecko, which was only, this is a mistake, sorry, I should say described first in 1995. It's endemic mostly to this one island here in the Grenadines, but it is scattered throughout a few of these smaller islands as well. It was only described in 1995, but by 2011, it was apparent that it was being illegally traded and smuggled off the island. And by 2019, trade is now considered the leading threat for this species, and it's at a very, very real risk of going extinct. So I was born in 1995. Within my lifetime, the species that wasn't even formally described has gone from being newly discovered to on the verge of extinction because of this sort of trifecta of globalization. And part of what makes trade so difficult to predict and anticipate is because the reasons why people participate in trade are so diverse. So they might trade live animals, they might trade things that are derived from live animals, dried wood, powdered products, etc. And they do it for a whole variety of reasons. Some of them are cultural, some of them are just to make money. It really varies. From the Australian perspective, because our lab specifically has been focusing recently on invasive species, we're hammering down on the trade of live animals. And in Australia, that's predominantly as pets, whether that be for ornamental displays or for companionship or sometimes for cultural reasons. And like I said, these pets can now come from anywhere in the world to make their way here. But is that actually a problem? Well, the data shows that the answer is it's a pretty big problem. So we looked at animals, vertebrate animals, so mammals, birds, reptiles, and amphibians that were being imported to Australia illegally and then illegally kept in captivity and then were making their way into the wild. And what we found was that we are steadily accumulating new species arriving in the country over time. What you'd hope to see is that the more you sample, the more you catch animals. If it's a closed population, this should start to level off, meaning we've saturated our accumulation of species, and we now know all of the species that are coming in. We are not seeing that saturation at all, which is in part to those effects of globalization, which I mentioned previously. But the more concerning trend, because new species might arrive, but if they stay in captivity, they're not really having an impact as an invasive species, but we're actually seeing a near exponential increase in the quantity of animals that are actually making their way into the wild, so into Australian ecosystems, into our agricultural landscapes, into our urban landscapes. And with that comes a whole host of potential disease transmissions and a variety of effects associated with invasive species. So it is a problem. Why is it a problem? How did we actually get into this situation? Well, Australia, if you've seen something like Border Force, Australia has a strong reputation for biosecurity, especially at the border, and it's mostly deserved, but it's patchy. So, with respect to the exotic pet trade, what we were doing prior to the 1980s was we had a prohibited list or a no list, negative list. If it's on that, then you cannot bring it in. But it wasn't a very large list, which means that if you had the right paperwork in order, you could legally import a lot of different pets into Australia. And then people started to captively breed them, move them between different states and jurisdictions. And then obviously over time, we started to realize that this was a problem when some of them started to escape. The problem is that we have quite poor record keeping from those periods. So we don't fully know which species were imported and which were not. After 1982, Australia changed its mind. It had a new legislative approach. So we now much more strictly control what you can import. The problem is that people still try to illegally import new species, and sometimes they're successful. So that means that if we detect a new species being traded and it's already crossed the border, we didn't detect it at the border, it's already here, it's almost impossible to know whether that originates from an illegal smuggling attempt or the legacy of the pre-1982 policy approach that we just haven't seen before. And so it gives people this loophole of plausible deniability to keep bringing in new species, which is really, really bad. Like I say, we don't really know which ones are already here. There's a few sort of government audits, but they are not perfect. And we rarely need a more systematic way of finding out which alien species are here so we can start to anticipate which of them might become invasive. So we need to monitor the trade, basically. Why? Because we know from data that we've analyzed that the more animals you have in captivity, proportionally the more escape into the wild, and the more that escape into the wild, the higher the chance is that they will establish a new population. So simply, if we have trade in a highly invasive species, we need to reduce that trade as much as possible, and we'll proportionally reduce our risk of having an invasive species on our hands. But where is trade actually occurring? Well, primarily these days it's happening online. Some physical trade does occur, but the vast majority of it is online. And the internet as a whole entity from a trade perspective is sort of stratified into three layers. So we have the surface web, which is kind of what you think of when you think of the internet. If you go into a search engine like Google and type pets for sale, the surface web is what you're going to be looking at. So pet stores, classifieds like eBay and Craigslist and all those sorts of things. The things that you can find with a search engine. Then there's the deep web, which is essentially one layer abstracted from the surface web. It often requires some sort of private account or some sort of approval to access. It's usually not indexed on search engines. So, for example, most social media is considered the deep web. And finally, there's the dark web, which you require specialized software to use and isn't indexed on any search engine. But how do you actually monitor any part of the trade? And how do you do it in a way that is fast? Because obviously there's an enormous amount of trade occurring. You don't want one person in a basement glued to their desktop, slowly chugging away, trying to type out what's being traded. So we used an approach called web scraping, otherwise known as data mining, which is basically just a semi-automated code-based means of collecting data from a given website. So we find a list of websites that we know are taking place in wildlife trade. And then for a given listing on that site, we investigate the specific details that we want. So maybe we want the image, we want to know what species is for sale, how much it's being sold for, whether it's a male, whether it's been captively bred, what year it was born in, etc. And we design the web scraper specifically to extract that information and put it into a structured database so that we can analyze it. So then we can take that clean database and communicate it to the relevant people like government agencies and say, hey, this thing is being traded on this website. You might want to look into that. And that's exactly what we did. So we looked at reptiles, amphibians, birds, and both freshwater and marine fish traded in Australia. We looked at a particular snapshot, so basically the months prior to Australia closing its borders due to COVID, because we wanted to investigate a sort of business as usual situation so that we can compare it with the COVID affected situations in the future. And that resulted in 12 websites with a lot of trade happening on them. And we end up with a library of over 15,000 scientific names, as well as sort of the more jargon sort of names that the hobby uses to refer to these animals. And this is what we found. So, this was over a period of 3.5 months, and it was actually an enormous amount of trade taking place. I mean, Australia has a population of about, I think, sort of 24 million people. So it's not a huge country. 3.5 months, there's more than 100,000 animals being advertised online. And this is not including your domestic animals like your cats, dogs, rabbits, and that sort of thing. This is exotic animals. Of those, a pretty sizable proportion of birds and especially fish were not native to the country. So that's really concerning. In terms of species, the majority of fish were non-native and the majority of birds were non-native as well. So it totaled 665 species of alien species in Australia that are being traded in a pretty open way without any real regulation. So extremely concerning, way more than we were expecting going into this project. And I'll just sort of speed through the rest of it because I suspect I'm burning up a lot of time. But one of the main concerning things is that when you look at the species accumulation curve, so basically the more you sample, you should hope to saturate a curve. You should see a leveling off of that curve. And that means that you've probably sampled all of the available species in that pool of potential species. So it means for birds, we're getting this level off of the curve, which means we probably have captured all of the diversity of birds that are being traded online in our analysis. But for fish, we did not see that same leveling off, which means despite there being something like 800 plus species of fish in our 3.5 months of sampling, we still have not saturated that pool of species. So it's probably closer to 1,000 or maybe even higher. And there's been some real challenges from our perspective trying to actually identify what's being advertised online. So, you've got a lot of things that are hybridized, and sometimes they're hybridized across multiple generations, across many different species. You have what I'm calling pseudotaxa, which are animals that have not been taxonomically described yet. So they're not even technically a species, but they're already in the trade. So hobbyists and traders have just come up with their own naming system so that everyone's referring to the same thing, even though it's not even a real species yet. And if it's not a real species, it definitely doesn't have any sort of evaluation or risk assessment related to its invasive potential. So that's a big unknown. And then another one is that because people are captively breeding different exciting color morphs or varieties, that makes it actually hard sometimes to identify the species that animal actually came from. And this is just to quickly identify that we studied vertebrates in our case study, but some other people in our lab are studying different contexts. And it's pretty much the same problem, sometimes even worse. So the invertebrate trade is pretty rampant in Australia, and it's completely unregulated. There's no risk assessment going on, which is very concerning. And same for the ornamental plant trade. And a lot of this is just outright illegal, and it's taking place on these websites, which should be enforcing it, and they're not. So we have a lot of work to do. We have a lot to fix. And finally, just really quickly to flag that the exact same problem is happening in the reverse direction. So native Australian species are being harvested from the wild and smuggled out of the country. And while that's, from our perspective, it's a conservation issue, not so much a biosecurity issue, but for the recipient countries, it definitely is going to be a biosecurity issue for them. So these complex problems are very linked together. So just to quickly wrap up, yeah, the globalized pet trade has massive biosecurity and conservation implications for Australia, but for any country, really. And in the Australian example, there are legislative loopholes that are being actively exploited, and I suspect that that is also true elsewhere. And the trade is far more diverse than we previously realized, which shows the value of actually getting this systematic monitoring in place. So ultimately, hopefully what we can do now going forward is to provide evidence-based guidance for better management of both native and non-native pets in Australia. And just to acknowledge some collaborating and funding bodies, and to acknowledge the co-authors as well, and that my contact details are at the top of the screen there. If you want to get in touch with me or have any questions that you don't get to ask today, I'm happy to do that. And thanks for your time.
Thank you. We do have a few minutes for questions if anyone has any questions for Adam. I have just one basic question, and I'm sure you have an answer to it. Has there ever been the notion of entertaining just not allowing any exotic pets into Australia?
Yeah, there has been that notion, but it's very patchy. So, and this is only something that I learned in the process of doing my PhD. So Australia completely prohibits the import of any alien reptile species. And they're really quite strict about it. Like, people can get jail time if they possess even like an American corn snake, which over here is the sort of cosmopolitan, almost vanilla species to keep, when over there people pay hundreds of dollars to smuggle it in. So with some taxa, there is that mentality. With other taxa, it's less so. And so, for example, in particular for ornamental fish, there's still about 4,000 species of ornamental fish that you can, with the right permit, of course, you can bring into the country. And the reason for that disparity seems to be, to the best that I can find out through talking to government, seems to be the context at the time that that legislation was put in place. So the reptile trading hobby is a lot younger than the cage bird trade or the ornamental fish trade. So when Australia was trying to, be stricter with its alien species trade, there was less backlash from the herpetological societies and the reptile keeping expo runners, and that whole community. It was a much quieter voice. And so compared to the ornamental fish trade, where there are businesses that make a lot of money out of this sort of thing, and there are societies that can get together and start petitions and all that sort of stuff. So it seems to be as far as I can tell, it seems to be more of a political decision than a biosecurity risk decision. And we are trying to draw as much attention to that as possible and get the government to maybe reconsider their approach. And there's positive signs that they are listening and they're aware of the problem. But we just need to bang a loud enough drum to make sure that they address it.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think that's probably true throughout the world. There's always a political angle to all of these issues. Okay, well, thank you very much, Adam. I guess we'll move on to Dr. Sheppard. If you want to get set up to share your screen, I will introduce you. So Dr. Andy Sheppard is a chief research scientist and adjunct professor at the Australian National University in Biosecurity. He is also co-executive director at the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry, CSIRO, catalyzing Australia's biosecurity initiative, and CSIRO's European Laboratory Director. Sorry for gumming up that. Hopefully I'm even pronouncing the acronym correctly. He is a population ecologist with an international reputation in biological control and risk assessment, focusing on the management of invasions of invasive plants, invertebrates, vertebrates, and diseases. He has published 2 books and many book chapters as part of more than 150 peer-reviewed publications. Welcome, Dr. Sheppard. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Good, excellent. Right. Well, unlike Phill and Adam, I'm actually from Canberra. I live in Canberra, which is Australia's capital, which means I'm pretty close to government. So I'm going to talk more at a more higher level around the patterns of invasive alien species in Australia and their impacts, and how Australia is addressing those threats from a policy response perspective, and with a particular focus on research, development, innovation. And I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people of the lands on which I live and work. And towards the end of this talk, I'll be just presenting a couple of slides on some work we've done with Indigenous Australians around managing invasive alien species. So I'll just break my talk into 3 areas. I'm just going to give an overview of global patterns and costs and impacts of invasive alien species before drilling down into equivalent data from Australia. So basically describing to you the scale of the problem, and then spend the remainder of the talk talking about Australia's strategy and policy response to try and address both the threats and impacts that invasive alien species cost us. So just going at the global level and looking at the environmental impacts of invasive alien species. Well, back in 2005, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment identified invasive alien species as the second driver of biodiversity loss. The IPBES Global Assessment in 2020 identified it as one of the top 5, so it's certainly a significant driver. And you can see here that invasives impact a whole range of threatened amphibians, birds, mammals, reptiles, fish, mollusks, and arthropods globally, and a key factor in 54% of known animal extinctions. And a lot of work's been done on trying to identify areas of the world that are specifically significantly under threat and of impacts from invasive alien species. So this is a global map, and as you can see, Australia, along with North America and parts of Europe, are heavily suffering from impacts of invasive alien species. Part of this may be due, of course, to the fact that we've got very good data from some of these areas. And there have been a couple of attempts to evaluate the global economic impacts of invasive alien species. Dan Pimentel in the 2000s did the first global assessment, and an InvaCost project, which is still ongoing, and Phill and I have been involved in it, has come up with a similar assessment of the global annual impacts of invasive alien species. What we do know is, well, certainly through those 2 processes, that the mechanism for measuring those impacts has improved enormously. But I think what we're all in unanimous agreement of is these figures are huge underestimates, and it's due to the lack of available data to really come with what the real impacts are. But the impacts are huge. And through the InvaCost project, there's an assessment here of the most costliest taxa globally, starting with mosquitoes and then going through a couple of vertebrates into some invertebrates. The other element that the InvaCost analysis showed us is that as the damage costs are increasing over time substantially, and I'll just note that this is a log scale, so this is a log curve, but plotted as a straight line. And while the damage costs are increasing, the actual amount of management costs means the amount of money that's being invested in management is declining in proportion to the level of the impact. So we've got a problem that's just spiraling out of control. Now, I'm just drilling down into this kind of data for Australia, where we do, thanks to a lot of work of the broad invasive alien species community, we do have much better data. What's the picture look like for Australia? Well, just like every other part of the world, we've got clear evidence that the scale of the impacts have been increasing massively over time. The estimate is that alien pests, weeds, and diseases have cost Australia over $390 billion over the last 50 years. And there's been about a 6-fold increase in these impacts and costs per decade. And the current estimate is around about $25 billion per year. And this is about half an order of magnitude increase on previous assessments when we did this work and published this paper together in 2021. As I say, Phill is also part of this work. So looking more broadly at Australia, invasive alien species affect nearly 2,000 of our 600,000 listed species, and have been involved in over 100 extinctions. And as Phill said, we have the highest global mammal extinction rate. Invasive alien species are the #1 driver in Australia of threats and impacts to threatened and endangered species. Here I list a number of them, and they're affecting 82% of the listed species across all groups. So this means that in Australia, invasive alien species are our critical #1 problem to address. And the impacts on biodiversity and ecosystem services are poorly measured, but we estimate they're at least greater than or equal to the cost to agriculture. And most of the economic data comes obviously from cost to agriculture because it's hard to measure in monetary terms impacts on biodiversity and ecosystem services. Just look across the groups, and Phil's given us a very detailed presentation on vertebrate pests, so I won't dwell on that, but I will point out that here that pet fish are, as Adam said, the area where we have the least ability to control and we're seeing the greatest problems. But if we look at invasive alien plants, for example, we've had over 3,000 species that have naturalized, and about 800 of those have become invasive, and the numbers appear to be increasing. We're picking up about 15 new species per year of naturalizations. Amongst invertebrate pests, there are at least hundreds of species that have not been well studied. The numbers again seem to be slightly increasing at roughly 2 new species being picked up a year. Plant pathogens, we know there are thousands of exotic species, but we seem to be better at keeping those out through our biosecurity protocols because the numbers of new species arriving appear to be declining slightly. And obviously their impacts are on agriculture and the environment. Animal diseases, again, new strains arrive, and Australia is under particular threat from a number of animal diseases at the moment. And marine pests, again, seem to be increasing. We're successfully preventing a lot of introductions through things like effective ballast water management, but there are still species getting in. I won't cover vertebrate pests because Phil's done that, but if we look at weeds or invasive alien plants, they make up 16% of our flora, and 16 to 20 of our worst weeds were deliberately introduced through the horticultural and ornamental plant trade. And now they're the plants are the top threat to agriculture, costing about $6.6 billion per annum. And they threaten ecological communities, Ramsar sites, and many of our rare and threatened species. And they also cause transformations of many of our unique natural ecosystems to the point where many of our native species can no longer survive. And the worry about invasive alien plants is probably most of our future problems are already in Australia, and they're sitting there as sleepers, and having a bit of a lag phase before their impacts start to build up. And moving to diseases, as I've already mentioned, a number of significant new animal diseases are threatening Australia, both directly, like we get outbreaks of avian influenza, as do other parts of the world, but we have a number of diseases on our doorstep, which is keeping the Australian government very focused on our biosecurity to keep them out. But there are a number of plant diseases in agriculture, and a number of critical diseases for the environment as well. Myrtle rust is a disease that takes out many species in our the largest family of plants, the Myrtaceae, that make up Australian forests. And a couple of species now of that have been affected are verging on extinction. And chytrid fungus, which is a fungus of amphibians, has arrived in Australia and led to the probable extinction of a couple of our native frog species. And Phytophthora is a challenge everywhere in the world for some of our native plant communities. So just looking back at Australia's experience, nearly all of Australia's pests, weeds, and diseases are from overseas. So we've had more than 120 years of experience to manage the problem. And this is why invasive alien species are the top threat to our biodiversity. So in order to meet this challenge, Australia has to be bold and come up with adaptive management approaches from the start. And Phill described a number of those. And we've also got to learn from our early mistakes, like the infamous story of cane toads being deliberately introduced into Australia and causing significant environmental impacts. So as a nation, we need a strategy and policy approach to try and address these impacts going forward and the challenges they pose. One of the first ways we can do this is to raise societal understanding of the issues. So we did a study a few years ago where we looked at, we measured public understanding of biodiversity and invasive species across these phases of social acceptance, from observation, emergence, through popularization, challenge, governance, and normative. They're like different stages in a path to greater understanding and belief. And we can see that invasive alien species are lagging behind biodiversity in societal understanding and in societal engagement. And in order to meet these challenges, we have to continue to push and support social engagement and understanding of the problem to get their approval in terms of the activities that we can do to try and manage these problems. So Australia has a national biosecurity system and policy approaches to really help us try and prevent new species getting in and manage those species that are already causing problems in Australia. And in that national biosecurity system, as a national number of governments, both federal and state, we're investing about $800 million per annum. And we've got risk assessment protocols that are well ensconced and being used both pre-border, border, and post-border. Pre-border around understanding the risks of and threats of individual species getting in, and post-border, to prioritize where we undertake our management based on the likely impacts, ongoing long-term impacts. As Adam already mentioned, we've adopted a positive list approach where we have a list of permitted species we can bring in, and anything that's not on the list is banned. And we're also trying to move towards a situation where the user pays. So anybody that may contribute to that risk through their activities, through trade, makes a contribution to the system that manages those threats and impacts. In 2015, we brought in a new Biosecurity Act, and one of the major components of that act was formalizing environmental biosecurity as a national priority, rather than just focusing biosecurity around agricultural production and trade. And late last year, we also had our first national biosecurity strategy, which has got a number of actions and brings the whole country together around prioritizing where we're going to make our investments to keep Australia safe and secure. From a research and development perspective, we've developed a national environmental community biosecurity RD&E strategy, which has identified the priorities for R&D investment. And these are, in simple terms, minimizing the invasion risks and pathways by investing in much more effective detection and diagnostics. Also, as Phill went into great length, really improving our capacity to eradicate and mitigate the impact of invasive alien species that we already have, using both biological, chemical, and genetic control strategies, just as Phill described. And our third area of priority is around quantitative evaluation of impacts and management to support the decision making on where we should make our investments, and through that identifying cross-sector conflicts and synergies between the agricultural sector and the environmental sector to make sure we can manage some of those challenging species that may have benefits to agriculture but are harmful to the environment. And I've just got 3 slides here that show our short, medium, and long-term, some of our short, medium, and long-term aims under this national strategy. So we really want to, in the short-term aims, we want to identify our environmental biosecurity RD&E priorities, and we've identified those now, and now implement those R&D priorities in terms of investment, which is ongoing. We've also put together a national priority list of exotic pests and diseases that haven't yet arrived and established in Australia, so as a way of targeting our efforts to keep them out. We've done a lot of work around prioritizing pathways of introduction, particularly for environmental biosecurity, and you saw Adam, the majority of his talk was tackling one of the critical pathways for environmental biosecurity issues getting into Australia. And we need to do this as part of our IUCN international standards and our commitments to conventional and biological diversity targets. So we're quite a long way down that pathway, pretty much complete. We're also focusing on better risk assessment and prioritization of invasive alien species using recognized standard and internationally developed systems, and also doing regional and national priority invasive alien species management actions. And these are involved doing studies that we've done in a number of regions in Australia to work out what's the most cost-effective action we can take to manage the impacts of invasive alien species on things like threatened species. And an area that Australia has really identified globally as being a loophole as hitchhiker pests. These are pests that come in as contaminants in containers in the movement of the trade in vehicles and so on. They're not associated with particular biological commodities, and we need better ways of preventing them from coming in. The medium-term aims really around improving our national geospatial data and analytics for being able to understand where invasive species are and where the impacts are. We need to have better indicators for monitoring and evaluation, for reporting change, and we need these both in our national reporting through the State of Environment report that we produce every 5 years, but also through our national biodiversity conservation strategy and our international reporting obligations under the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Sustainable Development Goals. We're trying to aim to develop track and trace systems for incursions for new priority pests. So we've completed this work now for fall armyworm and brown marmorated stink bug, 2 high priority pests that are either in Australia or about to come into Australia, to be able to be ready to track and trace them, just like we did with COVID, to try and work out where they've come from and take them out as quickly as possible, and better manage those high-risk pathways that Adam told us about. And similarly, tramp ants or exotic ants that form these super colonies and are a huge challenge around the world. We need better technologies to detect those. They're a #1 threat for environmental biosecurity. We go to more long-term. We're looking at long-term management strategies for those key feral animals. Again, many of the ones that Phill talked about, to ensure we're making the investments to maximize our chance of generating improvements and minimizing impacts. We've got to deliver our national key animal control programs, and on the back of the rabbit viral biological control program Phill talked about, we have another program in the offing to control European carp in our waterways using a koi herpes virus, and that's a national animal control program that we really need to invest in and make the decision as to whether we're going to release this virus to help control European carp. We need to develop those genetic control strategies that Phill talked about. We need to understand the interactions between climate change and invasive alien species. We really need to improve marine biosecurity, and we need to continue our strong work on islands as important biodiversity refuges, and advance geospatial tools around understanding where the invasions are coming from, how they're coming in, and understanding it through time in a geospatial manner, both where invasive alien species impacts and risks are going into the future across our environmental assets. And just to finish, a couple of slides on some of the work we've been doing with Indigenous Australian land management groups, because Indigenous Australians are our biggest land custodians in Australia, and they have an extremely important and significant role in managing not only the surveillance and the arrival of new pests and diseases, but managing those that are already on country. So we've been working with them to develop, and we need to develop more of them, new approaches for targeting some of the new invasive alien species, because these Indigenous ranges are at the forefront of the science and to help determine protocols and systems to provide that management. And they've already, through the work that the Indigenous corporations and land councils have done, they've already achieved globally significant outcomes. But we also have to recognize that there are synergies and trade-offs when you work with local communities, Indigenous and local communities, particularly on Indigenous land. Because while we want to improve land management outcomes around feral animal management or fire biodiversity, it's critically important those Indigenous Australians have strong livelihoods and get the benefits that they can from some of the feral animals like feral pigs and feral buffalo. So it's very important when you undertake management activities on Indigenous lands to look for co-benefits. Look for increased, how does the work you do lead to increased on-country employment, increased local community engagement, and support them in diversified sources of untied revenue in the significant role they play in managing Australia's biodiversity assets. And just a couple of finishing points on what you need to achieve success in these endeavors, and it's really around deep collaboration. So to build sustainable systems and management outcomes, we need this whole range of multidisciplinary skill sets working together: Indigenous engagement and local knowledge, remote sensing, and technology development around satellite and on-ground surveillance, smart apps and analytics to be able to identify species and collect and manage data to support decision making, other best practice decision support systems to ensure we're making our investments in the most cost-effective manner. We obviously need the science of invasion ecology, which Australia is very strong in, but so is North America and Canada, to be able to underpin the science. We need our social and economic scientists to be able to both understand and support community engagement, but also, as I say, to help measure those impacts. And of course, we need boots on the ground. We need large numbers of people who are connected into the system to provide that land management. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a very great overview and understanding how biosecurity policy has developed over the years. And really, Australia is absolutely the leader in biosecurity, I think, globally. Any questions for Dr. Sheppard? Robert Bailey, Dr. Bailey.
Thanks, Andrea, and thanks, Dr. Sheppard. That was great. I guess partially as a teaser to my class, we're talking about traditional ecological knowledge next week. So I was intrigued when your last couple of slides talking about engaging with Indigenous communities, and you mentioned the phrase local knowledge. Just wondering if you could unpack that a bit in terms of how it's worked in Canada. As you might know, different places. We've done a lot of work with so-called two-eyed seeing. You know, the Western science perspective, Indigenous perspective on how life works, including the effects of invasive species. Can you talk a little bit about how that may have figured into work in Australia, if at all?
Sure. Yeah. Look, I can give you one example, I think, which kind of captures it quite well. When in Kakadu National Park, which is an indigenously led national park in Northern Australia, an iconic national park, when there was a lot of work done on trying to identify which invasive alien species they should tackle. One of the most impactful invasive alien species in Kakadu is a semi-aquatic grass called paragrass, which invades the iconic wetlands of the Kakadu and prevents the magpie geese from nesting. And magpie geese are not only an iconic goose in the park, but they're also a very important food source for the Indigenous communities. And while everybody recognized it was a pretty important and invasive alien species to manage this paragrass, there was no practical means for them to understand how to improve that management and do it in a cost-effective manner. So while they had huge amounts of local knowledge, they didn't have the technology they needed to do that. So we worked with them around that challenge to come up with the use of drones and iPads that allowed them to survey the areas that are infected by paragrass in real time. And that allowed them to have decision support systems to understand not only where they should undertake their management, but to be able to see the benefits of those management in real time, in terms of not only the reduction in paragrass, but also things like the increasing numbers of nesting magpie geese, and just providing them with that technological tool, put paragrass from being down in the almost intractable invasive alien species for management in Kakadu, right up there as being a highly tractable one. And now they have an ongoing program to tackle that, which is leading to some very significant biodiversity benefits. So it just shows how if you can work with the Indigenous communities, listen to them, involve them in co-design and co-creation of technological solutions that support them, it can be a game changer for them. And I just want to point out that another key player in this was Microsoft, who came in and recognized through their corporate responsibility the value of supporting such a project from a technological point of view, and funded a lot of the initial support of the initial work to get the technology up and running. So again, you have to bring the private sector, the public sector, and the Indigenous sector together to get these outcomes.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Great. Now, this is a time for, anyone from the audience to ask questions to the speakers. If there's a specific speaker you'd like to address a question to, or if you just have a general question, please ask now. You can raise your hand or you can type it in the chat. Peter.
Yeah, only if there's no students, Andrea.
Yeah, no, it looks like you're the only one.
For now, okay. Love to hear questions from the students. But thanks very much, everyone. And this is great prelude also to our symposium tomorrow on technology and environmental governance. The question I had was related to public opinion. We all know that eradication campaigns in particular can be controversial. Phill, it was 20 minutes of how to kill. That's great. I mean, I think most of us have accepted the necessity of eradication campaigns to preserve biodiversity. But the public, on the other hand, is a bit more fickle, yeah? So, and I could tie this, I guess, to the passage of the Biosecurity Act, which is really landmarked for Australia, and I think a global example, as Andrea was saying. What was the public reaction to that? Or is there even enough public awareness to discern some sort of reaction? So I don't know who wanted to respond to this. I'd love to hear from any of you. Thank you.
Well, you only gave me 15 minutes, Peter, so that wasn't very fair.
That's good.
It's interesting because we see we have the Centre of Compassionate Conservation in Sydney that are co-authoring a lot on, like you say, the negative side of the welfare associated with animal control, and so it's hotly debated at the scientific level. And I think what that's done is it's put a lot more impetus back on that decision making, and what we're actually controlling for, and what the biodiversity and economic recovery is. And so there's a lot more nuanced thought going into it. With new technologies that are coming out, we're also seeing a lot of effort put into understanding the social and political willingness for these technologies that has certainly been missed in the past. And we're seeing a lot of debate around both native and alien pests, particularly the charismatic ones. So one of the real public issues in Australia is the brumbies, the feral horses in national parks, particularly Kosciuszko National Park, which is an iconic area, and around the waterways and the sensitive grasslands. These horses are having devastating impacts. But you get to people care less about brown marmorated stink bugs than they do about horses, and so you really see this causing a huge public conversation, discourse, and that's great for making sure that we do things in a conservation aware way. But we do need to also be aware that we're losing the biodiversity battle at the moment, and synergistically with climate change, we have to be making hard decisions around how we safeguard these environments and these natural assets for future generations, because in many ways we are losing.
Well, we have a few minutes left. I did have a list of questions, but obviously I won't be able to ask them all. But I think that's a good segue. Climate change was mentioned in the last few minutes. I don't know who wants to pipe up about, anything related to, climate change is happening. And obviously, it's having devastating impacts in Australia as it has in North America with floods and forest fires and wildfires. And so, any thoughts on how that's impacting the wildlife trade, invasive species, biosecurity, anything related, and whether it's helping or if it's actually exacerbating the problems? Who wants to volunteer?
Sure, I'll go ahead.
Thanks.
From a wildlife trade perspective, actually, I find that it's having a really interesting impact on the behavior of consumers. So people who buy exotic pets. I hear I know people that keep exotic pets. I'm friends with them. I don't exclude myself from that community as if I'm not a part of it. But there are people who keep them sustainably, and there are people who keep them unsustainably. So I hear their arguments about why they think it should be less regulated or should stay the same. One argument I hear a lot actually is with respect to particularly the keeping of Australian reptiles, but I'm sure the argument is valid for a lot of other things. This argument that they're going extinct rapidly, so we should have them in the captive trade because then it provides an insurance population, right? And so climate change is one of those things that gets put forward as a threatening process. The other would be feral species like feral cats, predation, and habitat clearance. And so there's this argument that, some of these reptiles are going to drop off, potentially within the next 10 to 15 years. Let's put them in the trade and get up a large breeding population. The problem with that, of course, is that it's not a controlled breeding population. Like, no one's monitoring the genetic diversity. They're captively breeding specific morphs that aren't present in the wild. Sometimes those morphs can come with deleterious alleles that have negative traits that make the survivorship of the species less. So that argument actually sort of stands on rockier foundations than it first appears to. But climate change seems to be almost this sort of cyclical logic of the less well a species seems to be doing, the more acceptable it seems to be in people's minds to put it in trade, forgetting, of course, that to get it into trade, someone has to go to a rocky outcrop and take all of the reptiles from that rocky outcrop, leaving it locally extinct. So it's kind of an interesting effect on people's behavior, and also, of course, that it is going to change the susceptibility of different ecosystems to invasive species, depending on how more or less it makes those ecosystems climatically similar to the native range of whatever's been transported there. So, I mean, that isn't necessarily going to be a blanket, effect across all the different landscapes. It sort of depends whether you're talking about an arid ecosystem or a temperate ecosystem. But it will change the invadability of different regions for sure.
Yes, well, thank you. That was a great way to end the event today. Thank you to those who are still remaining. I know that we're now right at the 3:30 mark. So please, join me in thanking our speakers for their wonderful presentations. And I guess I'll let you guys, hopefully you're all at home and you don't have to deal with this snowstorm that we're experiencing right now. And hopefully our Australian friends are getting a kick out of this. Well, I don't know about if it's a new experience, but definitely a rare experience for them. Take care, everyone. Thank you. And I'll see our Australian friends tomorrow at the conference. Bye.
Thanks all. Bye.
Thanks, Andrea.
Thanks.